In the depths of Buckingham Palace, behind bulletproof glass and laser security systems, lies a collection worth over $3 billion. Yet some of the most magnificent pieces in the crown jewels collection haven't seen daylight in decades. These aren't damaged treasures or forgotten relics, they are jewels so steeped in tragedy, scandal, and heartbreak that even queens refuse to wear them. What makes a piece of jewelry too cursed for royalty? What human stories are so powerful that they can render priceless diamonds and emeralds untouchable? Behind the glittering facade of royal ceremonies and state occasions lies a shadow collection of magnificent jewels that carry the weight of broken hearts, political disasters, and family secrets too dark to display. From a sapphire necklace that witnessed a queen's final moments to a diamond tiara that destroyed a royal marriage, these are the jewels that queens chose to lock away forever. Each piece tells a story of real people caught in the crushing weight of duty, love, and loss, stories that reveal the very human hearts beating beneath those golden crowns. These are the untold stories of the royal jewels that became too painful to wear, and the extraordinary women who made the ultimate sacrifice by choosing memory over magnificence. The morning of January 22, 1901, dawned grey and bitter over the Isle of Wight. Inside Osborne House, Queen Victoria lay dying, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Among them stood Alexandra, Princess of Wales, watching as an era came to an end. Around the dying queen's neck lay her most treasured possession, a magnificent sapphire and diamond necklace that had been a wedding gift from Prince Albert nearly 60 years earlier. Alexandra had always admired that necklace. The centerpiece was a Ceylon sapphire the size of a robin's egg, surrounded by perfectly cut diamonds that caught light like captured stars. Victoria had worn it to every important state occasion, every family celebration, every moment that mattered in her 63-year reign. To Alexandra, it represented everything majestic about the monarchy: power, continuity, and the weight of history itself. When Victoria drew her final breath at 6:30 that evening, the necklace passed to Alexandra as the new queen consort. Protocol demanded that she receive the jewelry immediately, as part of the seamless transition of power. The Lord Chamberlain himself removed it from Victoria's still warm neck and placed it in a velvet-lined case. Alexandra accepted it with trembling hands, understanding the magnitude of what she now possessed. The first time Alexandra wore the necklace was at Edward VII's coronation in Westminster Abbey. She felt the weight of it against her throat as she knelt beside her husband, feeling the eyes of the empire upon them. The sapphire caught the light from thousands of candles, and she felt connected to every queen who had come before her. This necklace would be her legacy, she thought, something to pass down through generations of royal women. But Alexandra's joy was short-lived. Within months of the coronation, tragedy began to shadow the necklace. Her youngest daughter, Princess Maud, fell gravely ill with typhoid fever. Alexandra wore the necklace to every prayer service, every medical consultation, believing somehow that Victoria's spirit would protect her family. When Maud recovered, Alexandra credited the necklace with bringing divine intervention. The pattern continued for years. Alexandra would wear the necklace during times of crisis, hoping for the protection she believed it carried. When her son Prince George nearly died in a hunting accident, she wore it to the hospital. When political tensions threatened to tear apart the empire, she wore it to state dinners and diplomatic receptions. The necklace became her talisman, her connection to the strength she believed Victoria had possessed. But the necklace seemed to bring as much sorrow as salvation. Each time Alexandra wore it, something terrible would happen within days. After wearing it to a garden party in 1905, news came that her nephew, Tsar Nicholas II, was facing revolution in Russia. When she wore it to Prince George's wedding, a fire broke out in the chapel's vestry, nearly destroying priceless artifacts. The coincidences piled up, one after another, until even Alexandra began to wonder if the necklace carried more than just sentimental value. The breaking point came in 1910, during the constitutional crisis that would define Edward's reign. The House of Lords was blocking liberal reforms, and the king faced the possibility of creating hundreds of new peers to force through legislation. Alexandra wore the necklace to a crucial meeting with parliamentary leaders, praying for wisdom and strength. That very evening, Edward collapsed with bronchitis. Within days, he was dead. As Alexandra sat beside her husband's deathbed, she touched the necklace unconsciously. Edward had been perfectly healthy that morning. The doctors couldn't explain the sudden severity of his illness. In her grief-stricken state, Alexandra began to believe that the necklace carried a curse, that Victoria's spirit was somehow trapped within it, bringing death to those who dared to claim her legacy. The funeral preparations were elaborate and exhausting. As Queen Dowager, Alexandra was expected to wear the full regalia of mourning jewelry, including the sapphire necklace. But, on the morning of the service, her lady-in-waiting found her sitting in her dressing room, staring at the jewelry case with tears streaming down her face. She couldn't bring herself to put it on. The weight of all those deaths, all those tragedies, seemed to emanate from the stones themselves. Instead, Alexandra chose to wear simple pearls to Edward's funeral. The official explanation was that the pearls had been a personal gift from Edward, making them more appropriate for the occasion. But those closest to her knew the truth. She believed the necklace was cursed, and she refused to risk any more tragedy. After the funeral, Alexandra locked the necklace away in a specially constructed vault beneath Marlborough House. She gave strict instructions that it was never to be worn again, by her or anyone else in the family. Her ladies-in-waiting thought grief had temporarily unbalanced her mind, but Alexandra was resolute. The necklace would remain hidden, its supposed curse contained behind steel and stone. Years passed, and Alexandra never wavered in her decision. When her son George became king, his wife Queen Mary asked about the missing necklace. Alexandra's response was immediate and firm: the necklace was not to be discussed, not to be displayed, and certainly not to be worn. Mary, sensing the depth of emotion behind the decision, never brought it up again. Alexandra lived for another 15 years after Edward's death, but she never again wore any jewelry that had belonged to Queen Victoria. She couldn't shake the feeling that the old queen's spirit was somehow bound to those precious stones, waiting to reclaim what had never truly been given away. The rational part of her mind knew it was superstition, but the grieving widow in her couldn't take the risk. Friends and family tried to convince her otherwise. They pointed out that Victoria herself had worn the necklace for decades without incident. They reminded her that Edward had died of natural causes, that coincidence was not causation. But Alexandra had seen too much, lost too much, to risk any more heartbreak. The necklace would remain in its vault, beautiful and deadly, waiting for a queen brave enough to challenge its supposed curse. The irony was not lost on those who knew the full story. Queen Victoria had commissioned the necklace as a symbol of eternal love, something that would bind her to Albert even after death. Perhaps she had succeeded too well. Perhaps some bonds are too strong to be broken, even by death itself. The sapphire necklace became a monument to love that had transcended mortality, but also a warning about the price of holding on too tightly to those we've lost. To this day, the necklace remains in its vault beneath Marlborough House. Occasionally, a new royal bride will ask about the magnificent pieces in storage, only to be told that some jewels are best left undisturbed. The official records list it as part of the royal collection, but no photograph has been taken of it since Edward's coronation. It exists in a strange limbo, too valuable to destroy, too dangerous to display. Alexandra's decision may have seemed irrational, but it revealed something profound about the nature of grief and memory. Sometimes the most precious things become too painful to bear, their beauty overshadowed by the sorrow they represent. The necklace was magnificent, but it carried the weight of every moment Alexandra had suffered while wearing it. In choosing to lock it away, she chose peace over prestige, emotional healing over historical continuity. The curse of Queen Alexandra's sapphire necklace was perhaps not supernatural at all, but something far more human: the unbearable weight of associating beauty with loss, magnificence with mortality. In a world where queens are expected to be symbols rather than people, Alexandra's choice to protect herself from further pain was perhaps the most human thing she ever did. The Cartier workshop in Paris buzzed with excitement in the autumn of 1936. Master craftsmen worked around the clock, setting hundreds of diamonds into what would become the most talked-about tiara in modern history. The commission had come from King Edward VIII himself, a wedding gift for his intended bride, Wallis Simpson, the American divorcee who had captured his heart and threatened to topple the British monarchy. The tiara was extraordinary in every sense. Designed in the Art Deco style that Wallis adored, it featured over 300 diamonds arranged in geometric patterns that seemed to dance with light. The centerpiece was a flawless 20-carat stone that Edward had personally selected, insisting it matched the brilliance he saw in Wallace's eyes. No expense was spared, no detail overlooked. This would be the crown jewel that announced Wallis Simpson to the world as Queen of England. Jacques Cartier himself supervised the final assembly, understanding the historical significance of what they were creating. This wasn't just jewelry, it was a symbol of a love so powerful it was reshaping the British Empire. Edward had already made it clear that he would abdicate rather than give up Wallis. The tiara represented his absolute commitment to choosing love over duty, personal happiness over royal obligation. When the completed tiara arrived in London in November 1936, Edward was beside himself with joy. He had never commissioned jewelry before, but every detail exceeded his expectations. The diamonds caught light from every angle, creating a corona of brilliance that would make Wallis shine like the star he believed her to be. He planned to present it to her at a private ceremony, a symbol of his intention to make her his queen regardless of the constitutional crisis it would create. But the tiara arrived during the most turbulent weeks of Edward's reign. The British press had finally broken their silence about his relationship with Wallis, and public opinion was sharply divided. Parliament was in uproar, the Church of England was threatening revolt, and the Dominions were questioning their loyalty to the crown. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin visited daily, each conversation more tense than the last, begging Edward to reconsider his plans to marry a twice-divorced American. Edward gave Wallis the tiara on November 25, at Fort Belvedere, his private retreat in Windsor Great Park. She was speechless when she opened the blue Cartier box, tears streaming down her face as the diamonds caught the firelight. She had never owned anything so magnificent, had never imagined that such beauty could be hers. Edward placed it on her head himself, stepping back to admire how it transformed her into the queen he was determined she would become. For 3 weeks, Wallis wore the tiara in private, practicing her royal wave in front of mirrors, imagining herself at state occasions and diplomatic receptions. The weight of it on her head felt like destiny fulfilled, like all the pain and scandal of the past year had been worth it for this moment. She was going to be Queen Empress, and this magnificent tiara would be her crown. But, as December progressed, the constitutional crisis deepened. The Archbishop of Canterbury refused to perform the marriage ceremony. The governments of the Dominions threatened to break from the Commonwealth if Edward proceeded with his plans. Even Edward's own family turned against him, with his mother Queen Mary refusing to receive Wallis at Buckingham Palace. The walls were closing in, and everyone could feel it. The breaking point came on December 3, when Baldwin delivered an ultimatum: marry Wallis and abdicate, or remain king and give her up. There was no middle ground, no compromise possible. Edward would have to choose between the crown and the woman he loved. As he paced the drawing room at Fort Belvedere that evening, Wallis sat silently, still wearing the diamond tiara, both of them knowing their dreams of ruling together were crumbling. The next morning, Edward made his decision. He would abdicate and marry Wallis as a private citizen. But, as he began drafting his abdication speech, the full weight of what he was giving up hit him. The British Empire, the Commonwealth, centuries of royal tradition, all sacrificed for love. The tiara, sitting on Wallis's dressing table, began to look less like a symbol of triumph and more like a monument to destruction. Wallis tried to convince him to reconsider. She offered to step aside, to disappear quietly, to let him keep his throne. But Edward was resolute. If he couldn't have her as his queen, he would have her as his wife in exile. The tiara would never grace a coronation, but it would adorn the woman he loved more than any crown. On December 11, Edward VIII signed the instrument of abdication, becoming the first British monarch in history to voluntarily give up the throne. That evening, he made his famous radio broadcast to the Empire, explaining his decision to step down for the woman I love. As his voice echoed across the airwaves, Wallis sat in her room at Fort Belvedere, staring at the tiara that had cost a kingdom. The immediate aftermath was devastating. Edward, now Duke of Windsor, was effectively exiled from Britain. Wallis was vilified in the press as the woman who had destroyed the monarchy. The tiara, once a symbol of their triumph, became a reminder of everything they had lost. The diamonds seemed duller somehow, tainted by the knowledge that they had sparkled while an empire fell apart. Their wedding took place on June 3, 1937, at the Château de Cannes in France. It was a small, private affair, nothing like the grand state wedding they had once imagined. Wallis wore the diamond tiara, but, instead of feeling like a queen, she felt like an actress playing a role in someone else's tragedy. The weight of the diamonds was nothing compared to the weight of guilt she carried for the chaos their love had caused. The years that followed were marked by bitterness and regret. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor lived in exile, never fully welcomed back into the royal family. They attended glamorous parties and lived in luxurious homes, but they were always outsiders, always carrying the burden of what their love had cost. The tiara became a fixture at social events, but observers noted that Wallis never seemed entirely comfortable wearing it. By the 1950s, the Duke was showing signs of deep depression. He had given up the most powerful position in the world for love, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had betrayed his country and his family. He began drinking heavily, and their once passionate relationship deteriorated into bitter arguments and long silences. The tiara sat unused in Wallis's jewelry box for months at a time, too painful a reminder of dreams that had turned to dust. The marriage that had once seemed like the greatest love story of the century slowly revealed its darker truths. Edward was possessive and demanding, unable to build a meaningful life outside his royal role. Wallis was increasingly isolated, cut off from her American friends and never fully accepted by European society. They had each other, but the cost of their love had been so high that it poisoned everything around them. In her private letters, written decades after the abdication, Wallis revealed the true cost of the tiara. She admitted that she had never truly wanted to be queen, had never asked Edward to give up his throne. The magnificent jewelry had become a chain binding her to a choice she had never made. Every time she wore it, she was reminded that she was the woman who had destroyed the British monarchy. The Duke died in 1972, alone except for Wallis, who was already showing signs of the dementia that would consume her final years. As she sat beside his deathbed, she clutched the diamond tiara in her hands, remembering the young king who had loved her enough to give up everything. But love that demands such sacrifice, she realized, might not be love at all, it might be something far more destructive. After the Duke's death, Wallis rarely left her Paris home. The tiara remained in its case, unworn and unloved. When visitors asked about her famous jewelry, she would change the subject or claim she couldn't remember where she had put it. The truth was simpler and sadder, she couldn't bear to look at it anymore. When Wallis died in 1986, the tiara was sold at auction along with the rest of her jewelry. It fetched over $2 million, bought by an anonymous collector who was presumably unaware of its tragic history. But those who knew the full story understood why no royal family member bid on it. Some diamonds carry too much pain to ever be worn again. The tiara that was meant to crown a queen instead crowned a woman who spent 50 years paying for a love that had promised everything and delivered only isolation and regret. It stands as a reminder that some prices are too high to pay, even for love, and that the most beautiful things can become the most painful when they represent dreams that destroy more than they create. Today, the tiara's location remains unknown. Perhaps its new owners wear it happily, unaware of the broken marriage and shattered kingdom it represents. Or perhaps it sits in another vault, too beautiful to destroy but too painful to display, waiting for someone brave enough to risk wearing diamonds that once caught the light of a love that burned down an empire. Queen Mary stood at the window of her private sitting room in Buckingham Palace, watching the London fog roll across the courtyard. In her hand, she held a small velvet box containing an emerald brooch that had become too precious and too painful for her to ever wear again. The date was November 11, 1919, the first anniversary of the Great War's end, and she was surrounded by memories of the sons she would never see again. The brooch itself was deceptively simple, a single Colombian emerald the size of a shilling, surrounded by small diamonds and set in platinum. King George V had commissioned it in 1895, shortly after their marriage, choosing the emerald because its deep green reminded him of Mary's eyes when she laughed. It was meant to be her everyday piece, something she could wear to informal occasions while still maintaining the dignity expected of royalty. Mary had worn the brooch constantly during the early years of their marriage. It became her signature piece, photographed on her lapel at charity events, garden parties, and family gatherings. The press nicknamed it the Queen's Companion because it appeared in nearly every official portrait taken between 1895 and 1914.
For Mary, it represented the happiness of her early motherhood, the joy she felt watching her 6 children grow up in the relative peace of the Edwardian era. The brooch was pinned to her dress on July 28, 1914, when news arrived that Archduke Franz Ferdinand had been assassinated in Sarajevo.
Mary didn't understand the significance at first. Europe was always having some political crisis or another. But, as the summer progressed and armies began mobilizing across the continent, she realized that the peaceful world she had known was about to disappear forever. When Britain declared war on Germany in August 1914, Mary's life changed overnight. As queen, she was expected to rally the nation, visit wounded soldiers, and maintain morale on the home front. But, as a mother, she was terrified. Her eldest son, Prince Edward, was 20 years old and desperate to serve on the Western Front. Her younger boys were already talking about joining up as soon as they were old enough. The brooch, which had once symbolized domestic happiness, now felt like a weight pressing against her heart. Mary threw herself into war work with characteristic determination. She visited hospitals, organized relief efforts, and transformed Buckingham Palace into a more austere wartime residence. The emerald brooch accompanied her everywhere, a small piece of normalcy in a world gone mad. Wounded soldiers often commented on it during her hospital visits, saying it reminded them of England in peacetime, of gardens and meadows they hoped to see again. Prince Edward finally got his wish in 1916, when he was posted to France as a staff officer. Mary tried to remain stoic during their goodbye, but her hands trembled as she adjusted the emerald brooch on her lapel. It was the last piece of jewelry Edward touched before leaving for war, and she clung to the superstitious hope that it would somehow keep him safe. Every morning, she would pin it on and whisper a prayer for his protection. The news about Prince John came first. Her youngest son, afflicted with epilepsy, died suddenly, in January 1919. He was only 13 years old, and his death devastated Mary in ways she hadn't expected. John had been hidden away from public view due to his condition, but he was still her baby, still the child she had rocked to sleep. She wore the emerald brooch to his funeral, but its weight felt different now, heavier, somehow, as if it were absorbing her grief. But it was the news about Prince George that truly broke her. Her second son had survived 4 years of war, only to die in a flying accident in August 1919. George had always been the most light-hearted of her children, full of jokes and mischief. His death felt like a cruel joke from fate, to survive the bloodiest war in history only to die in peacetime. Mary was wearing the emerald brooch when the telegram arrived, and she never forgot the sound it made when her trembling hands dropped it to the floor. The brooch cracked when it hit the marble, a hairline fracture running through the emerald from top to bottom. The jewelers assured her it could be repaired, that the crack would be invisible once properly set. But Mary saw it as an omen, a physical manifestation of how her heart had broken. She had the brooch repaired, but she could always see the flaw, a reminder that some things, once broken, are never quite the same. After George's funeral, Mary couldn't bring herself to wear the brooch anymore. Every time she looked at it, she remembered all the times she had touched it while praying for her son's safety. It had become a talisman, but one that had failed her when she needed it most. The rational part of her mind knew that jewelry couldn't protect anyone, but the grieving mother in her felt betrayed by this small piece of stone and metal that had promised nothing but delivered heartbreak. King George tried to convince her to continue wearing it. He reminded her that it had been a symbol of their happy marriage, that she shouldn't let grief overshadow 30 years of joy. But Mary was adamant. The brooch belonged to a different woman, a mother who still had all her children, a queen who believed that love and prayers could protect her family from the world's cruelties. That woman was gone, and the brooch belonged in the past with her. Instead, Mary locked the brooch away in a special jewelry box in her private safe. She gave instructions that it was never to be cleaned or polished, never to be reset or altered. It would remain exactly as it was on the day George died, crack and all, a monument to the children she had lost and the innocence that had died with them. Her ladies-in-waiting thought it was morbid, but Mary found a strange comfort in preserving it as a relic of her former happiness. The years passed, and Mary never wavered in her decision. When her surviving children married and had children of their own, they would sometimes ask about the missing brooch. They remembered it from their childhood, remembered how their mother would let them touch the green stone before bedtime. But Mary would simply smile and change the subject, unable to explain that the brooch was too connected to her lost babies to ever be worn again. During World War II, when her grandson Prince Philip was fighting in the Royal Navy, Mary's daughter-in-law suggested she wear the emerald brooch for luck. The young queen thought it might be comforting to have the family talisman back in circulation. But Mary refused with unusual sharpness, explaining that some talismans lose their power when they fail to protect what matters most. The brooch would remain hidden, its magic tainted by the memory of all the prayers it hadn't answered. In her final years, Mary would sometimes take the brooch out of its box late at night, when the palace was quiet and her memories were strongest. She would hold it up to the light, watching the emerald catch the lamplight through its crack. The flaw made it more beautiful somehow, she thought, more honest about the nature of love and loss. Perfect things couldn't tell the truth about life, but broken things told stories that mattered. Mary died in 1953, and the brooch passed to her eldest surviving son, now King George VI. He understood its significance and chose to keep it in the same jewelry box where his mother had hidden it. When George VI died and Elizabeth became queen, she too was told the story of the emerald brooch and the two princes who had died too young. Elizabeth, herself a mother, understood why such a piece could never be worn again. The brooch remains in the royal collection today, although it has never been photographed or displayed publicly since 1919. Royal jewelry experts know of its existence, but none have ever been allowed to examine it closely. It exists in the same limbo as other pieces too painful to display, too historically significant to dispose of, but too emotionally charged to ever see daylight again. Modern royal mothers sometimes ask about it, drawn by its reputation as a protective talisman. But they are always told the same story, that some jewelry is meant to be looked at, some is meant to be worn, and some is meant to remember. The emerald brooch belongs to the third category, a keeper of memories too precious and too painful to share. The crack in the emerald has never been repaired. Palace records indicate that Queen Elizabeth II specifically ordered it to remain untouched, understanding that the flaw tells the story better than any perfect stone could. It serves as a reminder that even queens cannot protect their children from the world's cruelties, that love is not armor against loss, and that sometimes the most meaningful jewelry is the kind that can never be worn again. In a world where royal jewels are symbols of power and continuity, the emerald brooch represents something more human and more honest, the reality that love always comes with the risk of loss, and that the most precious things are often the ones that hurt too much to hold. Queen Mary's decision to hide it away was not an act of weakness, but an acknowledgement that some pain is too sacred to display, too private to share with a world that expects queens to be symbols rather than mothers who mourn. Princess Margaret sat in her bedroom at Clarence House, staring at the ruby ring that had become the most controversial piece of jewelry in the British royal family. The morning light caught the Burmese stone, sending red fire dancing across the walls, but Margaret saw only the reflection of a love that had nearly torn the monarchy apart. It was Christmas morning, 1955, and she was about to make the most difficult decision of her life. The ring had arrived just 3 days earlier, delivered by private courier from Garage Jewelers on Regent Street. Group Captain Peter Townsend had commissioned it months before, working in secret with the royal jewelers to create something worthy of a princess. The central ruby was exceptional 5 carats of pigeon's blood red stone from the famous Mogok mines, surrounded by diamonds that had been carefully selected to complement Margaret's delicate features. It was an engagement ring fit for a future queen. But Margaret would never be queen, and Peter Townsend would never be her husband, despite 3 years of passionate love that had scandalized the establishment and captivated the world. The ring represented everything they had dreamed of and everything they could never have, a love that was pure and true but impossible within the rigid constraints of royal protocol and religious doctrine. Their romance had begun innocently enough in 1952, when Townsend was serving as equerry to King George VI. Margaret was 22, beautiful, and rebellious, while Peter was 16 years older, handsome, and recently divorced. The age difference meant nothing to them, but the divorce meant everything to the Church of England and the government. In 1955, the monarchy could not survive another scandal involving a divorced man. The abdication crisis of 1936 was still fresh in everyone's memory. Margaret had fought for their love with every weapon at her disposal. She argued with her sister Queen Elizabeth II, pleaded with the Archbishop of Canterbury, and threatened to renounce her place in the line of succession. But the establishment was immovable. If she married Peter, she would lose her royal status, her income, and her place in the only family she had ever known. The choice was brutal in its simplicity: love or duty, happiness or heritage. The ruby ring had been Peter's final gambit, his last attempt to show Margaret that their love was worth any sacrifice. He had spent months designing it, incorporating symbols that only she would understand. The ruby was the same color as the roses in the garden at Royal Lodge, where they had first kissed. The diamonds were arranged in the pattern of the Southern Cross, which they had seen together during the royal tour of South Africa. Every detail was a love letter written in precious stones. When Margaret first slipped the ring onto her finger, it fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all her life. She had never worn anything so beautiful or so meaningful. The weight of it reminded her of Peter's hands holding hers, of whispered promises in darkened corridors, of a future they had planned in stolen moments away from prying eyes. For 3 days, she wore it constantly, unable to take it off even while sleeping. But the pressure from the palace was relentless. Prime Minister Anthony Eden visited daily, explaining the constitutional crisis that would result from their marriage. The church made it clear that they would not perform the ceremony, and the Commonwealth governments threatened to withdraw their support if Margaret defied convention. Even Queen Elizabeth, who loved her sister dearly, begged her to consider the consequences for the monarchy itself. The breaking point came on Christmas Eve, when the Queen Mother sat Margaret down for a conversation that would haunt both women for the rest of their lives. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had always been Margaret's closest confidant, the one person who understood her passionate nature and rebellious spirit. But now she spoke as the Queen's mother, not as Margaret's friend. The monarchy could not survive another scandal, she explained. Margaret's duty was to her country first, her family second, and her heart last. That night, Margaret sat alone in her room, twisting the ruby ring around her finger until her skin was raw. She thought about the life she could have with Peter, a small house somewhere quiet, children, ordinary happiness. Then, she thought about the life she would leave behind: royal duties, charitable work, the chance to make a difference in the world. She was trapped between two equally valid but incompatible dreams. The next morning, Christmas Day, Margaret made her choice. She would not marry Peter Townsend. The announcement would be made after the holidays, but her decision was final. As she prepared for the family's Christmas service, she removed the ruby ring for the first time since receiving it. The indentation it left on her finger looked like a wound, she thought, which was exactly what it felt like. But Margaret couldn't bring herself to return the ring to Peter immediately. Instead, she kept it hidden in her jewelry box, taking it out occasionally to remember what might have been. The ruby seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, reminding her of all the passion she had given up for the sake of duty. Sometimes she would put it on late at night, when the palace was quiet and no one would see her wearing the symbol of her sacrifice. The official announcement came on October 31, 1955. Margaret's statement was carefully worded, explaining that she had decided not to marry Group Captain Townsend after considering her duty to the Commonwealth and the Church. What the statement didn't mention was the ruby ring, sitting in its box like a small red accusation. Peter left for Brussels the next day, accepting a diplomatic post that would keep him far from London and the woman he loved. Margaret tried to move on with her life, but the ring haunted her. She would catch glimpses of red in shop windows and think of it. Other men courted her, but none of their proposals could compare to the perfect ring that represented perfect love. She began to understand that some losses are too complete to heal from, that some sacrifices echo through every subsequent choice. When Margaret finally married Anthony Armstrong Jones in 1960, she chose a completely different style of engagement ring, a traditional diamond solitaire that said nothing about passion or sacrifice. The ruby ring remained hidden in her jewelry box, a secret she shared with no one. Even her closest friends didn't know about it, though they sometimes wondered why Margaret never wore rubies despite their obvious suitability for her coloring. The marriage to Armstrong Jones was troubled from the beginning. They were both strong-willed and artistic, but they lacked the deep connection Margaret had shared with Peter. As the years passed and their relationship deteriorated into bitter arguments and mutual infidelity, Margaret would sometimes take out the ruby ring and wonder if she had made the right choice. The monarchy had survived, but at what cost to her personal happiness? By the 1970s, Margaret's life had become a series of scandals and disappointments. Her marriage was failing, her children were struggling with the pressures of royal life, and the press portrayed her as a spoiled princess who had never learned to be happy with her privileges. Only Margaret knew the truth, that she had given up the one thing that might have made her truly happy, and that the sacrifice had poisoned everything that came after. The ruby ring became Margaret's secret companion, a reminder of the road not taken. She never wore it in public, never showed it to anyone, but she kept it with her always. When she traveled, it went with her in a small velvet pouch. When she moved houses, it was packed in her personal luggage. It was the most valuable thing she owned, not because of its monetary worth, but because it represented the most honest moment of her life. In her later years, as age and illness took their toll, Margaret would sometimes confuse the past with the present. Nurses would find her holding the ruby ring, talking to it as if it were Peter himself. She would tell it about her day, about her regrets, about the children she might have had and the life they might have shared. The ring became a talisman of lost possibilities, a red star that had fallen from the constellation of her dreams. When Margaret died in 2002, the ruby ring was found in her jewelry box, wrapped in a letter she had written but never sent to Peter Townsend. The letter, written in 1955, apologized for choosing duty over love and expressed her hope that he would understand her decision. It ended with a promise that she would keep the ring forever as a symbol of the love that had been too pure for the world they lived in. The royal family faced a difficult decision about what to do with the ring. It was too personal to display, too valuable to destroy, and too painful to keep. After much deliberation, they decided to return it to Gerrard's, where it was quietly sold to a private collector. The proceeds went to the Princess Margaret Fund for Disabled Children, a charity that had been close to her heart. But those who knew the full story understood that the ring's real value could never be measured in money. It represented one of the greatest love stories of the 20th century, not because it had a happy ending, but because it revealed the true cost of duty and the price some people pay for keeping institutions intact. Margaret's sacrifice had preserved the monarchy, but it had also preserved something else, the memory of a love so powerful that it could only be honored by letting it go. The ruby ring of Princess Margaret stands as a monument to all the loves that are lost to duty, all the hearts that are broken on the altar of obligation, and all the women who choose sacrifice over happiness because they understand that some things are bigger than personal desires. In a world that celebrates following your heart, Margaret's story reminds us that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is break your own heart for the sake of something larger than yourself. Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna stood at the window of the Alexander Palace, watching her children play in the snow-covered gardens of Tsarskoye Selo for what would be the last time. Around her neck lay a rope of perfect pearls, each one the size of a cherry, lustrous and white as the Russian winter itself. The date was February 28, 1917, and, although Alexandra didn't know it yet, her husband Tsar Nicholas II had already signed his abdication papers. The 300-year Romanov dynasty was ending, and her pearl necklace would be the silent witness to its final, tragic chapter. The necklace had been a wedding gift from her mother-in-law, Empress Maria Fyodorovna, in 1894. Each pearl had been personally selected from the imperial collection, representing 27 years of Romanov rule. They had come from the depths of the Pacific Ocean, harvested by divers who risked their lives for these perfect spheres that would adorn the neck of Russia's future empress. The necklace was more than jewelry, it was a symbol of imperial continuity, a physical link connecting Alexandra to every empress who had ruled Russia before her. Alexandra had worn the pearls at every major event of her reign. They graced her throat at state dinners with European royalty, diplomatic receptions that shaped international alliances, and ceremonial occasions that reinforced the divine right of the Romanov family to rule. The pearls had witnessed the birth of her 5 children, the celebration of military victories, and the glittering balls that made the Russian court the envy of Europe. They were as much a part of her identity as her crown or her wedding ring. But the pearls had also been present during the darker moments of her reign. She wore them during the first stirrings of revolution in 1905, when workers marched on the Winter Palace demanding bread and justice. They hung around her neck as she prayed for her son Alexei, whose hemophilia kept the imperial family in constant fear for his life. She touched them nervously during the long nights when Nicholas was away commanding the army in World War I, leaving her to rule a country that was slowly tearing itself apart. The Great War had changed everything. Russia's military disasters, massive casualties, and economic collapse had turned the people against the Romanov family. Alexandra, with her German birth and mystical relationship with Rasputin, had become a particular target of hatred. The press called her the German spy and blamed her for Russia's suffering. But, through it all, she wore her pearls, clinging to the belief that God had placed her family on the throne and would protect them from their enemies. By early 1917, the situation was desperate. Strikes paralyzed St. Petersburg, soldiers refused to fire on protesters, and even loyal aristocrats were calling for Nicholas to abdicate. Alexandra, isolated in the Alexander Palace with her sick children, could only wait for news from the capital. She spent hours standing at her window, fingering her pearls like a rosary, praying for a miracle that would save her family and her country. The telegram arrived on March 2nd. Nicholas had abdicated in favor of his brother Grand Duke Michael, who had immediately refused the crown. The Romanov dynasty was finished. Alexandra read the news in her private sitting room, the pearl necklace catching the afternoon light as her hands trembled. In a single day, she had gone from being empress of all the Russias to just another displaced aristocrat, protected only by the dubious mercy of the provisional government. The family's captivity began immediately. Revolutionary guards surrounded the Alexander Palace, and the imperial family was confined to a few rooms in what had once been their magnificent home. Alexandra was allowed to keep some personal possessions, including her pearl necklace, which she wore every day as a reminder of who she had been and what she had lost. The pearls seemed out of place in their reduced circumstances, too grand for a captive, too beautiful for a prison. As the months passed and their situation grew more precarious, Alexandra began to see the pearls differently. They were no longer symbols of imperial power but witnesses to imperial collapse. Each pearl had seen the glory of the Russian court, but now they were seeing its destruction. The irony wasn't lost on her. These symbols of perfection and purity were adorning a woman whose world had become anything but perfect or pure. The Bolsheviks took power in October 1917, and the family's situation deteriorated further. They were moved first to Tobolsk and then to Ekaterinburg, each transfer taking them further from civilization and closer to their fate. Alexandra packed carefully for each move, making sure to include the pearl necklace among her few permitted possessions. She couldn't bear to leave them behind. They were the last physical link to her former life. In Ekaterinburg, confined to the Ipatov house, the family's living conditions were harsh and humiliating. Alexandra, once the most powerful woman in the world, now had to ask permission to use the bathroom and was subjected to crude insults from her guards. But she still wore her pearls every day, a small act of defiance against those who had stripped away everything else. The pearls reminded her that she was still an empress, even if she no longer had an empire. The end came on July 17, 1918. Alexandra woke early that morning, as had become her habit in captivity. She dressed carefully in a simple black dress and, for the last time, fastened the pearl necklace around her throat. She had no idea that this would be her final morning, that the pearls would witness not just the end of her life but the end of her family line. The routine of putting on the necklace had become a daily affirmation of her identity, a ritual that maintained her dignity even in the face of humiliation and despair. That night, Yakov Yurovsky, the commandant of the house, woke the family and told them they were being moved to a safer location. Alexandra didn't believe him. She had learned not to trust their captors, but she gathered her family and followed the guards to the basement. She wore her pearl necklace under a high-collared dress, the precious stones hidden but present, bearing witness to the final moments of the Romanov dynasty. What happened next was chaos and horror. The guards opened fire on the unarmed family, but the killing was botched and brutal. Some of the children survived the initial volley, protected by jewels sewn into their clothing. Alexandra died quickly, but the pearls around her neck were splattered with blood, her blood and the blood of her children. In their final moments, the pearls that had witnessed 1,000 glorious ceremonies witnessed instead the most shameful act in Russian history. The Bolsheviks tried to destroy all evidence of the murders, burning the bodies and disposing of the remains in unmarked graves. But they kept the valuables, including Alexandra's pearl necklace, which was cleaned of blood and added to the state treasury. The pearls that had once symbolized imperial continuity now represented revolutionary victory, a trophy taken from the defeated monarchy.
For decades, the necklace disappeared into the chaos of Soviet bureaucracy.
It may have been broken up and sold to fund the revolution, or hidden away in some forgotten government vault. Nobody knows for certain what happened to the pearls that had adorned the last empress of Russia. They vanished into history, just as the Romanov family had vanished, leaving only questions and legends behind.
The irony of the pearl necklace's story is profound.
Pearls are created through suffering. They begin as irritants that oysters cover with layer upon layer of nacre, transforming pain into beauty. Alexandra's pearls were formed in the depths of the ocean through millions of years of geological pressure, just as her own character was formed through years of personal and political pressure. They were perfect spheres created from imperfect circumstances, beautiful objects born from ugliness. In death, Alexandra achieved a kind of immortality that had eluded her in life. The woman who had been reviled as a German spy became a martyr for the Orthodox faith, canonized along with her family by the Russian Church. But the pearls that had been her constant companions for 24 years were lost forever, scattered to the winds of revolution like so many other treasures of Imperial Russia.
Today, no one knows where Alexandra's pearls rest. They might be in a private collection, their history unknown to their current owners.
They might have been destroyed decades ago, broken up for their individual value rather than preserved as historical artifacts. Or they might be waiting somewhere, hidden in a vault or private collection, bearing within their luminous depths the memory of the last empress and the dynasty that died with her. The story of Alexandra's pearl necklace is ultimately a story about the relationship between beauty and power, between personal identity and political reality. The pearls that had once represented the permanence of imperial rule instead became witnesses to its complete destruction. They remind us that even the most powerful empires are temporary, that even the most beautiful objects can become monuments to loss, and that sometimes the most precious things are the ones that carry the weight of history in their very essence. In choosing to wear her pearls every day until the end, Alexandra made them more than jewelry, she made them relics of a vanished world, witnesses to both the glory and the tragedy of absolute power. They serve as a reminder that all earthly kingdoms eventually fall, but the stories they tell through the objects they leave behind can endure forever, teaching us about the human cost of both wielding power and losing it.